might face when we seek a larger global footprint in the world. Now, this brings me back then to zooming in now a little more granularly and trying to look at India in this context. My talk was subtitled An Indian Perspective. So I think there are possibly several Indian perspectives. Mine is just one among many. And I think it's interesting to think about what an Indian perspective might mean. Of course, one way of looking at an Indian perspective is just to look at the official discourse and say, what is the official perspective on something? And there's usually one fairly clear official reading. Also, I think it's very important to be attentive to what goes as sort of important considerations as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned globally. The second issue is, I would suggest that there is no quintessential Indian position when it comes to thinking theoretically about international relations. I find it far more useful to suggest that we think about the world as viewed from India. So to what extent does context have a bearing on our frameworks? To what extent does context have a bearing on our, on our knowledge assessment or understanding of a particular situation? I think that's interesting to ask and think about, rather than to suggest that there is only one perspective or there's one quintessential view of what that might be. Now, one of the first questions I think the concept note seemed to suggest and asked me, I thought I felt the need to respond to some of these questions, was what can one learn from Indian foreign policy in the past? Okay, so the first element I think which is important when one is thinking about legacies of the past are also conceptual legacies. How did we conceptualize foreign policy in the past, and is it very different today when we think about foreign policy? So the term very often used in that early phase post-independence, if you think about the Afro-Asian Relations Conference, if you think about Bandung, if you think about ideas like the new international economic order, there was a term called non-alignment, which was used very often in the Cold War years to think about foreign policy. And I think non-alignment is a very useful and important concept because it allowed us to sort of retain a degree of flexibility, retain a degree of nimble-footedness in foreign policy, because it did not preemptively commit you to one position or the other. You assessed an issue on the basis of its merits, you developed a perspective on that issue, and you eventually decided to go along, planting a flag and, arguing the case for a particular reading of that issue which seemed to interest you. So non-alignment in that sense was important because it protected at least a degree of autonomy of decision making in a world which was marked by these two important, it was a bipolar world then. Some would characterize today's world as far more multipolar than bipolar, although some have suggested that we may be living in an era of a new Cold War with two poles again, with China and the United States in many ways also representing various forms of tensions or competition between a status quoist power, which is the United States, and a revisionist power, in this case China, which wants to revise the manner in which its place in the world is being thought of. So I would think non-alignment is one of the legacies of the past, but non-alignment also translates into various decisions. For instance, there's a certain aversion to alliances, far more restrictive. They would constrict choices. They would reduce the room available as attractive as retaining a degree of flexibility and more informality in these arrangements. The other issue is to think about the whole notion of a middle path and what this might mean as far as an Indian approach to foreign policy is concerned. Now, quite clearly, I think we know as a general principle, and this is not true only of India, but around the world, that bureaucracies tend to be rather conservative, and they're careful in the manner in which they proceed on questions of foreign policy as well, And very often there is a set of standard operating procedures where they go back to what was done in the past with regard to this issue, and there's an attempt sometimes to forge an element of continuity with the past, because you also want a certain degree of consistency to the extent it's possible in this realm in terms of working out a solution to a particularly pressing problem. So again here, I think it's interesting to think about what that might mean. And third, I would think that one of the elements from the legacy of the past is a certain cautious embrace of international institutions. India has been always a little wary, I think, beyond a point, because these international institutions, which are seen as sort of important elements which structure politics in particular sorts of ways, at least from the Indian reading, were not always necessarily sympathetic of, or they felt fair to their point of view. So again here, I think there is, of course, a keenness to participate in international organizations, institutions. I think there's a lot of work, for instance, about India's role in shaping even very important documents. So for instance, the understanding on human rights in the UN Charter, UN documents, Hansa Mehta played a very important role in that. Manu Bhagwan and others have chronicled some of this history. I think Nehru quite clearly very often embraced a certain degree of internationalism in that period. We took a position on a whole range of questions, from disarmament to decolonization to racial equality, and even the idea of the CTB, or the Comprehensive Test Ban, is very often traced back to that period. So there is that dimension, but there's also a certain degree of distance or wariness of institutions, because international institutions for a post-colonial state, for what was seen by some as a latecomer as far as the history of modern statehood is concerned, there's a certain degree of trepidation or a certain degree of caution in the manner in which international institutions were approached in this worldview. And I think these legacies still bear in many fashions, even in the contemporary. To me, the distinction between non-alignment and something like multi-alignment is not very huge, because non-alignment represented a way of defending your strategic autonomy. Multi-alignment is also an attempt to protect your strategic autonomy. The fact that you can have multiple alignment partners that you're not necessarily